Nowhere to Call Home by Cynthia DeFelice, Chapter 8. Frankie was awake the moment the motion of the train stopped. Daylight filtered into the car through the openings between the wooden boards, and she saw that Stewpot was awake also, and standing by the door of the car, which he had opened a crack. "Good morning," Frankie said uncertainly. She began to rise slowly, feeling stiff and sore and cold. At the same time, she felt proud. She had survived her first night as a hobo. "Mornin' yourself," Stewpot returned. "You was pounding your ear like a baby just now." Frankie thought for a moment, then smiled. "You mean I was sleeping like a baby, I bet," she said. "Right-o, I'm just looking out to see if the bulls are glimmin'." From this, Frankie figured he was checking to see if any railroad guards were patrolling the area. "Why?" she asked. "Are you bughouse? I don't fancy getting copped." "What I meant was," Frankie said with something close to panic, "are you getting off the train now?" "Sure am," said Stewpot. "This here's Pittsburgh. There's a jungle near here where we can get some grub and maybe a boil up, too." Frankie's heart leaped with relief to hear Stewpot use the word we. She had been afraid that he was going to hop off the train and disappear, leaving her alone. The careless confidence she had felt when she had first jumped the train had quickly faded. In the short time she had spent in Stewpot's company, she had begun to realize there was a lot more to trampin' than simply sneaking into a boxcar unseen. For one thing, it appeared that hobos had their own private language, one she needed to learn. She still couldn't imagine how or why they were going to the jungle, but she guessed she'd find out. And if that was where Stewpot was going, it was where she wanted to go too. He slid open the door about a foot, stuck his head out, and looked around, then slid the door open wider. Sunlight filled the car, and Stewpot stared at Frankie. "Guess you don't need no washin', though. Leastways not yet," he laughed, and pointed down at his overalls and jacket, which were streaked with soot and dirt. "Wait till you been on the bum for a while. Them duds'll look like these here." Frankie laughed, silently congratulating herself on figuring out that a boil-up meant to wash your clothing. She still wasn't sure if Stewpot was talking funny just to tease her, but she meant to show him that she was game. "I sure could use some grub," she said, grinning at him happily. "You learn fast, kid," said Stewpot, grinning back. "Let's go." He jumped down from the car and ran across the yard toward a grove of trees. Frankie grabbed her bag and followed. When they reached the safety of the trees, Stewpot turned his back to Frankie and fiddled with the front of his overalls. Soon Frankie heard the splashing sound of Stewpot relieving himself against the trunk of the tree. She quickly looked away, feeling her face turn red with shock and embarrassment. Where she came from, no one even talked about such indelicate manners, never mind performing them in front of someone of the opposite sex. Of course, she reminded herself, Stewpot thought she was a boy. Maybe this was how boys behaved when no girls were around. How was she to know? She wasn't in her fancy house on Spruce Street, with its modern bathrooms and closed locked doors, that was for sure. The worst thing, though, was that Frankie now realized that she also needed to pee, desperately. The sigh of relief Stewpot let out as he buttoned himself back up only made matters worse. But she couldn't pee against a tree like Stewpot, and if he discovered that she was a girl, he might ditch her right then and there, and tell her that tramping wasn't for girls, the way everyone else had. At the far end of the grove were some bushes, with the brown and gold leaves of autumn still clinging to their branches. Without saying anything to Stewpot, she headed toward them. "Hey!" Stewpot yelled behind her. "You want some?" He reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out some tattered sheets of newspaper. Realizing what he must be thinking, Frankie's face grew flushed all over again. But Stewpot merely handed her the newspaper matter-of-factly and sat down, his back against a tree, to wait for her. Frankie fled to the shelter of the bushes. Mingled with her relief was a huge worry. If she was going to stay with Stewpot, which she very much wanted to do, how long was she going to be able to fool him? When she rejoined Stewpot, he pointed ahead. "Up there a ways is the river, and a little ways past that is the jungle. But I just remembered a spot where we can have us a swim." Stewpot led Frankie to an abandoned stone quarry, where one of the pits was filled with water, forming a deep, clear pool. She noticed that as they walked, Stewpot leaned down from time to time to pick up sticks. Most he examined and threw back to the ground. A few he ran his hands over, almost lovingly, before placing them in the bundle he carried on his shoulder. Frankie wondered what made him keep one and toss another away, and why he wanted dirty broken sticks in the first place. But she had so many questions that she couldn't possibly ask them all. "Here now," said Stewpot, proudly gesturing towards the pool, as if he had magically created it with the sweep of his arm. "Ain't that pretty? Before Frankie could answer, he was taking off his jacket and kicking off his shoes at the same time. Next came his shirt, and then he unhooked the straps of his overalls. Frankie watched as they slid down around his bare feet. She tried not to look at the rest of him, which was bare as well. Her face flaming, Frankie directed her gaze to her feet, to the ground, to the trees, everywhere but towards Stewpot. He didn't seem to notice her discomfort. "Last one in is a rotten egg," he shouted, running toward the edge of the quarry and jumping in. He popped up and called, "Come on, it's not bad once you get used to it." The air was warm for November, but still chilly. Nevertheless, a bath would feel awfully good after a night spent in the livestock car, Frankie thought. But she couldn't undress in front of Stewpot. No doubt this was the sort of thing Mrs. Bailey had warned her about. She couldn't help wincing a little at the idea of Mrs. Bailey, or father, seeing her now. Glancing over towards Stewpot, she saw that he was splashing about, spitting long arcs of water into the air, not even looking her way. She considered for a moment, then began unbuttoning her coat. She had, after all, purchased boys' undershorts and an undershirt. Stewpot might think she was odd for keeping them on, but better he think her overly modest than that he realized she was a girl. Thankful for her straight, slender body beneath the underwear, she jumped in after Stewpot. He was waiting for her when she surfaced, gasping at the cold. Quickly he reached out and dunked her under. She struggled from his grasp, laughing and half choking, and swam after him to get revenge. Stewpot was older and stronger, but Frankie was the better swimmer, so they were evenly matched. Frankie was able to swim underwater as well, which allowed her to sneak up on Stewpot and take him by surprise. After one particularly stealthy ambush that resulted in a good dunking, Stewpot cried, "Uncle, I give!" He swam to shore, pulled himself up on the rocks, and lay face down. He was still laughing and panting when Frankie heaved herself up and stretched out on her stomach on the rock beside him, breathing heavily. Stewpot turned his face to Frankie and sighed contentedly. "That ought to get the crumbs out." "Now I give," said Frankie. "What are crumbs?" "Bugs," answered Stewpot. "Lice, you know?" Frankie didn't know, having never had bugs, but she didn't let on. She supposed she'd have them soon. Who could help it, sleeping in boxcars and jungles and who knew where else? Frankie lay shivering until slowly the sun on her back and the heat from the rock began to creep through her body. This must have been what Junius had been talking about, this delicious sense of freedom and well-being. The rock felt softer than the floor of the boxcar, and she cracked one eye open to say so to Stewpot. To her surprise, he was dozing, even though they had been awake for just a short time. When she heard Stewpot stirring, she raised her head and said, "I'm starved." "That makes two of us," said Stewpot. "Let's hightail it to the jungle and see if they got some mulligan going." He sat up and reached for his pants. Frankie turned away to allow him to dress. The sun had dried the back of Frankie's underclothes. Quickly she pulled on her shirt, trousers, socks, shoes, and coat, and picked up her carpet bag. She had noticed that Stewpot's pack was much easier to manage than hers. He simply rolled up his possessions in his thin blanket and secured it with a leather strap that he threw over his shoulder. Her bag, on the other hand, was a nuisance. The short leather handle meant she had to hold it down by her side, and she was tired of feeling it bang against her shins. She looked at it in frustration, trying to figure out a more convenient way of carrying it. "Here," said Stewpot, reaching inside his own bundle and pulling out a piece of rope. He tied it around one end of the bag, then measured about 3 feet of rope before looping it around the other end of the bag. "There," he said, handing it back to Frankie. "Now you can carry it over your shoulder, across your back like. There's times you're going to need both your hands free." As they headed away from the quarry, Frankie adjusted the bag on her shoulder until it fell comfortably across her back. She threw Stewpot a grateful nod. "That's swell," she said. After they had walked for what seemed a long time, they encountered a group of 5, headed in the same direction. It was obvious that the other people, too, were hobos. Frankie and Stewpot quickened their steps to catch up. As they drew closer, Stewpot called out, "Hey!" and the others turned around to face them. All 5 looked about the same age as Stewpot, which surprised Frankie. She had supposed that most tramps would be grown men who had lost their jobs. Yet here, counting herself and Stewpot, were 7 kids. She had thought her circumstances were unusual, but something must have happened to send so many others away from home too. These thoughts flashed quickly through Frankie's mind, but what really shocked her, causing her jaw to drop open with astonishment, was something else. 2 of the 5 young hobos standing before her were quite obviously girls.